All right, now it's time to talk about Elastic Block Storage, or EBS. EBS is not an internet accessible storage. Unlike S3, EBS is a subsystem of EC2. It is a supporting service to EC2. It is not a service that can stand on its own 2 feet independent of anything else. It provides a persistent file system for EC2. Again, you don't have to worry in this case about rebooting or terminating or stopping an instance. Your data is going to persist, and it does not need to be attached to an instance. So again, you can terminate or delete or stop an EC2 instance, but that volume will persist. And I'll show you a little bit later on when we get into the demo how volumes have a separate section. So you can always provision volumes and not necessarily attach them to an EC2 instance. You can detach them and attach them to a different instance. So you have flexibility from that perspective. Again, think of EC2 as a volume or as a disk that you would add essentially to a virtual machine. It can be transferred between availability zones. Now, I want to be careful with this statement. When I say it can be transferred between availability zones, that doesn't mean that this is an automatic seamless thing where you can switch between availability zones and that particular volume will be there. But you can leverage technologies like snapshots and other to make sure that that particular EC2 or that particular volume, that EBS volume, is available across a different availability zone. It supports incremental snapshots, which means you can take the initial snapshot, and let's say that initial snapshot was 30 gig in size, right? You make changes to that particular image again, and then you want to take another snapshot. It's not going to take that entire disk again. It will take the difference between 30 gig and what was made, what was created, the additional. So if the additional changes were 2 gig in size, it would capture 2 gig of snapshot as opposed to 32 gig all over again. So that helps in terms of saving space, but also helps in the agility of that particular snapshot. Because it's lighter, it's mobile, it's easier to move around. Now, EBS leverages S3 storage for snapshot storage, right? So what that means is that EBS also leverages the capabilities of S3 to store the snapshots that it's capturing, except it doesn't store the snapshots in an area of S3 that we can access. So I'll show you a little bit later on also that after we take a snapshot, we can go into S3 and we won't find it. So EBS has access to a private area on S3 where it stores the snapshots that it captures. You also have the concept of provisioned IOPS. Provisioned IOPS are very important and they're very crucial sometimes when you have specific workloads that have an IOPS requirement in order to function properly from a performance and latency perspective, right? So that's when you can go in and say, you know what, for this particular application to function properly, I need to have 4,000 IOPS. With the provisioned IOPS capability or feature, now you can go in and say, I want an EBS volume with this provisioned IOPS, and obviously you pay more for this type of service, but at least you're able to get the level of performance needed in order to make sure that your application and your workload perform properly. Now, without further ado, there's a lot to cover. This is going to be a very exciting demo. Let's jump into our demo and take a look at how we can configure a lot of this stuff. All right, from your AWS Management Console, you'll find that under Storage and Content Delivery, there is no EBS. You won't find it anywhere. Again, and the reason you won't find it anywhere, it's because it's a subset of EC2. So in order for you to access and start provisioning EBS, you have to enter EC2. So if we go into EC2, you'll find that I have 0 running instances, although I have provisioned instances, right? So I have an instance, except it's not running. We really don't need it for the purposes of this demo. So if I go back one step here, just so I can show you kind of, let's go back to the EC2 dashboard. You'll find that as far as volumes are concerned, I have one volume that's been provisioned. Now that's where you can go in order for you to create your EBS instances. So if I click on volumes here, you'll find that I have this particular volume that was created during the provisioning of the instance that I have. So this is a particular volume in this case that's dedicated to that particular instance. Now what you'll find here is that the volume type is GP2. Now GP2 stands for general purpose. Now if you scroll down a little bit here and you come to where it says, volume type, if you just simply highlight your mouse over it, you'll find that you have several different types of volumes, right? You have your magnetic, you have general purpose, you have SSD, you have provisioned IOPS, right? So these are the different types of volumes that you can create. More information that you can gather essentially off of this particular volume is, you have your volume ID. There's the size here. It was provisioned off of this particular snapshot, the creation date, the availability zone that it's in. It's important to note which availability zone it's in. And it's always important to know which availability zone you are in, because when you're creating these volumes, you want to make sure that you're creating them in the right availability zone. Otherwise, you won't be able to attach them to the instances that are in that availability zone. So be careful while creating your volumes to create them in the availability zone where the instance is located in order for that attach process to work. Now, what you'll notice is that the name here, it doesn't really have a name. And as you start to create multiple volumes, you're going to need some way of differentiating these volumes so that you know which one is fast or slow, or if you want to tier it a certain way, you want to be able to do that. So for our purposes, what we're going to do is we're going to simply click on this little button here, and let's just call this one GP, just to keep it simple for general purpose. You can call this maybe tier 1 or tier 2, depending on the type of tiering that you have within your environment. So once you do that, it automatically associates that. All right, so now let's talk about creating a volume. So the creation process is pretty simple, straightforward. You probably figured it out. We're going to click on create volume here. And you're going to be presented with this particular window. Now, from the drop down, as far as type is concerned, you have the option again of either creating a general purpose. You can create an SSD, you can create a provisioned IOPS, or you can create magnetic. Now, I think the most interesting one of all of those is probably the provisioned IOPS here. So if I select on provisioned IOPS, you have the option again of configuring a particular IOPS level for your application. So in order to keep things simple, I can keep this at 100 gig, and the level of IOPS that I'm getting is 3000. But what I want to do is probably minimize this a little bit. So let's go ahead and do, for example, 20 here. Now, as far as availability zone, again, if you forget which availability zone you're in, the easiest way is to lower this window a little bit and take a look here. You can see that behind you, you should be in 2B if you're going to connect it to the same instance that this particular volume is connected to. And that's kind of what I want to do here. So I'm going to go ahead and select 2B. And whoops, so one of the things that I didn't do here is when I changed the size of the volume that I'm trying to create down to 20, I also have to kind of adopt the IOPS level in order to match that. So in order for me to kind of recalculate the IOPS level for a disk size of 20, you have to do that 30-to-1 ratio basically. So which means if I do 30 times 200, I'm going to end up with 600 IOPS here, and then that should allow me to, again, if I wanted to change the availability zone to 2B, I can do that. And you can also base this particular volume off of a snapshot. So if you wanted to create just a blank volume, great. But if you wanted to base it off of a particular snapshot, then you can do that. So you have all of these snapshots that you can choose from, these AMIs that you can choose from. This is essentially taking a snapshot of the C drive or the D drive of a particular AMI. It's like stealing their local drive. Now, the other thing to keep in mind here is if you've created snapshots, and we haven't yet, but if you had any of your snapshots already created here, then what you could do is you can leverage those snapshots in order to create a volume as well. For the purpose of my demo, I'm actually going to leave that blank. If you wanted to encrypt that, then you can do that as well. And then what we want to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on create. Now remember, this particular volume hasn't been attached to any instance yet. But before we do that, let's go ahead and give it a name. Now, I showed you how you can give it a name by simply clicking on this kind of pen-like icon here. But if you wanted to do it a different way, you can essentially select this particular button on the right. Let's go ahead and unselect that. But you can select this, and you can come down here to tags. And tags give you a little more flexibility because they give you some more options as far as what you can configure. Now, in this case, it might not be much, but you still have the option of creating tags. So what you want to do here is click on Add Edit. and you can click on this particular link and it'll give you access to all the different tags that you can create, whether it's for taxonomy, if you're trying to create it for reporting purposes, if you're trying to do it again to make sure how much you're paying, or there's 100 different reasons why you're using tags. But essentially for my purpose, all I want to do is add a name. So I'm just going to click on create, and what we want to do here is click on name. As soon as I start typing, if it's a tag that it recognizes, it's going to prompt me. And then I don't know, maybe we'll do this as tier 0 for the fastest tier disk, for instance. And once you're ready, we're going to click on save, and voila, it changed the name automatically. Now, in order for you to attach it to an instance, again, it's very simple. We're going to right click on it down here. You can also use the actions menu up here if you wanted to, and simply come down here to where it says attach volume. We're going to click on attach volume here, and then we're going to go ahead and find that particular instance. And in my case, I only have one. It found it automatically, so I'm going to go ahead and select it. You can, again, choose the device. And this will be the device name that shows up for Windows in your disk management in order for you to add and create a volume out of it and give it a drive letter, essentially. Once you're ready, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click on attach here. And bada bing, bada boom, take a look at that. It is now in use. So it went from being available to being in use, which means it is now attached to that instance. Now let's fast forward a little bit, right? So let's assume that, this is 2 hours later or 3 hours later or a couple of days later where you've made changes to this particular volume, added data to this particular volume. And now what you want to do is you want to back up, or you want to take a snapshot of this particular volume. Again, taking a snapshot is relatively easy. You either right click on the volume down here or from the actions menu up here. What you can do is you can come down here to where it says create snapshot. You can come in here and say, I don't know, let's name this for simplicity's sake, wired brain coffee 01, just to keep it simple. And you can give the snapshot whatever you want to call it. Call it maybe, I don't know, October 10 for the snapshot. It is not being encrypted. Once you're ready, we're going to go ahead and click on create. The snapshot is being created or has been created. We're going to click on close. Now, where you can see that the snapshot is available is down here in snapshots. You'll see that it's available. Now, recall during the presentation, I told you that EBS stores its snapshots in S3. So what I want to do is I'm going to take you back to our S3 bucket. So if we come up here and we go into S3, well, first of all, what you'll notice is we only have one bucket, which is the wired brain coffee. But even if we go into that particular bucket, there you go. There is no snapshot that is available here. So again, EBS stores its snapshots in a private area on S3 that is not accessible to us. Again, so you can again take a look at the volumes here. You have both of those volumes that are now available. Now, if you wanted to create a new volume based on the snapshot that you just created, what you can do again is if you go through the same wizard that we just went through, and let's just assume for simplicity's sake that this is a general purpose, for example, and we want to put it in the availability zone of 2B. Down here, you would have to look for the snapshot ID essentially. Now you'll find that there are tons of snapshots here. So it's a little difficult for you to find the particular snapshot that you're looking for. Now I'm going to venture out to say maybe this is the particular snapshot that we created, but you would have to again figure out this, the snapshot ID. Now let me show you an easier way, and I'm also going to show you how to find the snapshot ID. But what is the last four on this? 5A6. All right. Let's go ahead and cancel out of here. And instead of being in here, if we go into snapshots, you're going to find that this is the snapshot ID. And I was wrong, that wasn't it. But this is the snapshot ID that essentially you would be looking for. Now, if you know the snapshot ID that you're trying to create a volume out of, well, why don't you just come to snapshots right here and then just essentially right click on it and go down to create volume. What that will do for you is immediately put that snapshot ID up here for you. And then what you can do is simply go through the standard settings that we went through earlier and put it in the right availability zone and then create it. And bada bing, bada boom, you're off to the races, right? So I'm not going to go ahead and create another one. It kind of defeats the purpose, but you guys kind of get the idea here. We're building a volume off of this particular snapshot, and that could be useful again depending on whether or not you want to clone something, or if you have a snapshot that you just essentially want to break up into a separate EC2 instance, you can do that. Now, the other thing that you can do is you can also create volumes a different way, right? So I showed you how to create a volume from here. You can obviously create the volume from here as well. You can come up here again to the actions and just create volumes. So there's several different ways of doing it, but you can also add volumes at creation time as you're launching some of these EC2 instances. So if you're up here on the dashboard and you come into launch instance, for example, and we went through earlier, I'm just going to pick any one at this point just to show you the idea. If we go through and let's select this particular one, and we're going to go through with this as far as the instance type, let's go ahead and select next configuration here. I'm going to keep all of these a default, and we're going to move on to the next option. You'll find that over here you can now create a new volume, right? So if you wanted to do this at creation time, you can also add a new volume here. You can select whether or not it's EBS, for example, in this case. You can also build it off of a snapshot. So again, if you're trying to grab your snapshot or another snapshot off of an AMI, you can also do that at this point. So again, it's the same process. It's just different ways of accessing it. I just wanted to make sure that I was giving you the different scenarios by which you can access this. Now, the one thing that I want to talk about before we move on to Glacier, let's go ahead and cancel out of here and let's go back into volumes. Now, we talked about the fact that you can create what's known as provisioned IOPS, where you're going in and saying, you know what? I want to create a provisioned IOPS volume that is 4,000 IOPS because I have an application that requires this particular performance level. Now, another thing that you can do that's an alternative to provisioned IOPS that you should consider from a price perspective, just in case it makes sense, is instead of going down the provisioned IOPS route, what you can do is provision several different volumes, right? So let's say you needed 100 gig and you're provisioning 10 EBS volumes that are 10 gig in size each, right? And they are not provisioned IOPS. So they're getting whatever the standard IOPS rate is for the SSD, whatever SSD is giving you as far as standard IOPS is concerned. What you can do is if you end up with, let's say, 10 hard drives, and these 10 hard drives are each 10 gig in size with a specific amount of IOPS. You can then attach those to the instance, and when you boot up Windows, you go into your disk management. Disk management is going to realize that it now has 10 new devices. You should be familiar with that, right? It's very standard. As soon as you add a VHD or a VMDK, for instance, or in the physical world, as soon as you add a new hard drive into your server or into your computer, disk management in Windows is automatically going to pick it up, or you can scan for it and it's going to pick it up. So imagine in this case, if you do a scan, it's going to pick up 10 devices that it now sees in its operating system. What you can do then is provision these 10 devices, and you can create a dynamic LUN out of them, right? Maybe you're creating a RAID 0 LUN, which is striping without parity. Now, striping without parity is going to give you incredible performance. So maybe, just maybe, going this route might give you the number of IOPS that you need at a lower cost. Now, I'm sure you're probably thinking, but Eli, if I'm doing RAID 0 without parity, that means any disk that fails in my RAID group essentially destroys the entire RAID group. You're correct. But remember what I told you earlier. The durability is very high. Why? Because it is replicating your data in the same availability zone and across availability zones. So the risk of a drive failing is very, very, very low. So in this case, you might be able to take the risk because, again, the data is available so much, these drives are being replicated so many times that it's extremely unlikely that a disk will fail. So again, it's a weighted risk that you would have to take into account, but it's something that I wanted to make sure I'm mentioning just so that you know, okay, well, there's more than one way to kind of skin this cat. Glacier. What a cool name, right? Now, while it has a really, really cool name, Glacier is synonymous with very, very slow. So if you were expecting something rock solid, you've got something else waiting for you. So it's very, very cheap storage. It's like a penny per gigabyte. There's a lot of buzz around Glacier. Everybody wants to use Glacier. I think after I show you kind of what you can do with Glacier, some of you might be a little underwhelmed, but it's really, it serves a particular purpose really, really well. Now, it's useful for data that is not accessed frequently. It's ideal for backup, for example. Now, you can use Glacier not just for backing up your enterprise data, but you can also use it for backing up your personal data. You can use tools like Cloudberry, for instance, Explorer in order to interface with Glacier. So the thing that I wanted to talk to about Glacier is the fact that it doesn't really have an intuitive user interface from an Amazon perspective. It was built in order to provide RESTful APIs so that a third party would leverage Glacier from an infrastructure perspective, would leverage Glacier from a platform perspective to build valuable services on top of it. So the same way Dropbox leverages S3, for example, to provide you that interface, that rich user experience, that mobility of the data, etc., there are a ton of third-party providers that leverage Glacier in the background in order to make it a target, for example, for backups. So whether you're using it at home or you're using it in the enterprise, Glacier can be a target for backup if you're using a provider that is using Glacier for that purpose. So it's very useful for infrequently accessed data, ideal for backups. Now, it's very slow from a retrieval times perspective. Now, when I say very slow and when I say retrieval time, and I have 4 to 6 hours here, it might be a little bit less, maybe a little bit longer. But the idea here, and it's not just the restore process. Even if you were to do a directory listing of the items that were inside Glacier, it will take a very, very long time. I'm sure Amazon is using very high capacity disks. There's this concept of these cloud disks that are coming out. They are very, very large capacity disks, but they're also very, very slow. So, and you can't write to them more than like 40 or 45 times before the drive dies. So the idea here is you store this type of stuff for long-term retention, but you don't necessarily access it that frequently. So the other thing is it's high durability. It's going to last for a very, very long time as well. There is a cost for restore. So it's not just the fact that you're hosting your storage on Glacier for a penny, for example, a gig, but when you go to restore your data from Glacier, you get another set of costs that's associated with it. There is encryption that's available in the form of AES 256-bit. And again, I've mentioned this several times, but it is a penny per gigabyte. It is really, really cheap. Let's switch over to the presentation purposes. There's really not much to show beyond the creation of a vault, but I want to show you how to create a vault. And I also want to get into how do you assign a user permissions in order to access Glacier. So not only do you need a third-party software, a user interface essentially to interact with Glacier, but you have to make sure that you have the right permissions configured in the background in order to allow that third-party tool, that third-party software that you're going to use to interact. So you have to grant that permission. It's not something that will happen seamlessly. Let's go ahead and take a look how this works. All right, so under storage and content delivery, we're going to go ahead and select Glacier. And again, it's very, very simple. You pretty much have one button. We're going to go ahead and click on Create Vault. And for my purposes, what we're going to do is create Wired Brain Coffee Vault. Let's keep it very simple. And you can go ahead and continue creating notifications and all that stuff. But for the purposes of our demonstration, we're just going to go ahead and create that vault. Now, once the vault is created, you're going to click on it. And honestly, there's really not much to see beyond that. You can either create another vault, you can delete the vault. We're going to get into settings here in a second. And then you have your notifications. So you're essentially switching between the details screen and the notification screen, and you can configure all sorts of notifications. You can come in here into settings, and you can go with the you can create the free trial version of it. You can have the maximum retrieval rate. So you have some options as far as costing is concerned to choose from, but for the most part, from a configuration perspective, this is it, right? So now what we need to do is create a user account that can associate, that has access to leverage Glacier on the back end, so that when you go to a Cloudberry or when you go to a third party that can leverage Glacier in the background, in the back end, you can enter those credentials and get access to it. To do that, what we want to do is go back to the AWS Management Console here, and under the security, under administration and security, what we want to do is click on Identity and Access Management, otherwise known as IAM or IAM, depending on how you want to say it. If you go in there, you can do one of two things. You can either create a group and apply permissions to the group so that it's a lot more scalable. You can just drop users in there and those users automatically get access to the same policies and permissions that you've created. Obviously, that's best practice. For simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do right now is just go ahead and create a new user. And in this case, what I want to do is create a user called Glacier user. Keep it simple. And over here, what you're selecting is essentially the generation of an access key and a secret key, secret access key ID as well. This is essentially what the RESTful API will use. These are essentially the equivalent of a username and password, except there are long strings of alphanumeric numbers that you can use again to access this using RESTful API. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go ahead and click on Create. And what that has done already is it's created those credentials for me. So if I click on Show User Credentials, you'll see that you have now that username essentially and the password. It's an alphanumeric number. I highly recommend that you save this somewhere secure. You can also download like a CSV file that has these credentials provided. Now, the one thing to note here is if you don't download the file and if you don't make a note of these credentials, you won't be able to access them again. You'll always be able to see your access key ID. You won't be able to see the secret access key again. What you can do at that point, if you lost it for whatever reason, you can delete it, you can make it inactive, and you can create a new one, but you cannot get access to this same particular one again. So keep that in mind. So I've copied these to the clipboard, or you can download them. For the purpose of our demonstration, we're not really going to use them. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Close, and I'm going to click on Close again. Now you'll find that it's already created my username. So what I want to do is click on it, and you can obviously add it to a group. But what we want to do is we want to associate this particular user with the Glacier Vault that we created. So what I'm going to do is click on Attach here, and we want to select the policy. Now, out of the box, AWS does every effort to create kind of generic policies that you could use to apply to different environments, to different, they'll give you out of the box permissions so that you're not necessarily creating your policy from scratch, like full administrative control, power user, etc. For the purposes of taking you through the process, what we're going to do is we're going to use the policy generator down here, and then we're going to go ahead and click on Select. I want the effect that I'm trying to do is allow. You can obviously select deny. You want to select the AWS service that you are trying to configure. And in my case, it's AWS Glacier. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And then what we're going to do is from the actions here, you can get very specific, very granular as far as what permissions you want to grant this particular user. For the purpose of our example, we're going to go ahead and click on All. And then over here, you're probably wondering, well, what's an ARN? Well, this is essentially that identifier that identifies the vault. Now, we don't necessarily have that. So what we need to do is open up another tab and go get it, or we can pretty much leave this tab. Let's go ahead and actually cancel out of here. Let's go back to the dashboard. Let's go into Glacier. And if I select my vault down here, you'll find that this is the particular ARN number that we are looking for. So if you go ahead and copy this particular number, and we go back into IAM, we have a user that's already created. If we go through the user, we come down here to the policy, and we click on policy generator, select. We're going to allow. What we want to do here is select Glacier from dropdown. And from an actions perspective, we're going to give them access to everything. And what you want to do at this point is paste the entire ARN number. Once you're ready, click on Add Statement. Oh, whoops. Let's try this again. Let's go ahead and wipe it. Let's paste it one more time. There you go. Add Statement. So once you've done that, what we want to do at this point is go ahead and click on Next here. Now, this is where you can get into some JSON code and a lot of modifications. This is a very advanced concept as far as what's going on in the background to grant this permission. I wouldn't recommend you touch it at this point. Again, unless you're a developer and you really know what you're doing, the default of what's going on here is more than sufficient for the purposes of what we're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and click on add. And voila, bada bing, bada boom. This is very easy. So we created a policy. We've granted the user that we just created access to Glacier, right? So at this point, we now have the access code and the secret access code ID. So we have the username and password. We've given the user the permission to access Glacier. So at this point, the only thing left is for you to select the service that you want to use in order to interact with Glacier. So whether that's Cloudberry or anything else, any other service that you're choosing in order to back up or any of the other services that leverage Glacier, you will need those sets of credentials in order for you to get access to your vault here. And that's all there is to it, really, from a Glacier perspective. It's really a platform for third party to be able to extend services to you. So we started off by talking about understanding EBS. We talked about the fact that EBS is different than S3 in that it is not internet accessible. It's also a persistent type of storage, which means you don't have to worry about the fact of, whether or not you're terminating an instance, whether you're rebooting it, stopping it, etc. You can create EBS volumes outside of the instance. So they are not necessarily reliant on the instance to exist. You can create an EBS instance that's standalone. You can create additional volumes that you make available to attach to that instance or to attach a different instance. You can detach and attach to different instances. You can create snapshots out of a particular volume. You can create a volume based off of a snapshot. We also talked about the fact that snapshots are stored in a separate private location on S3. We then went in and created a volume on EBS. We did provisioned IOPS. We talked about the fact that you can do something alternative to provisioned IOPS, which is to provision several smaller sets of EBS volumes and maybe then present those to the operating system and use the operating system's RAID capabilities to give you the level of performance that you're looking for. We also did snapshots, and I also showed you how you can create volumes off of snapshots. After that, we talked about Glacier. We talked about the fact that Glacier is pretty standard from a configuration, from a setup perspective, as far as AWS is concerned. It's really a platform that you can use with third-party tools in order to leverage very, very cheap storage. We talked about the fact that not only is it cheap, it's also very slow, hence the name. And it's very, very slow. Like even getting a listing of a directory maybe will take you a couple of hours in order for you to do. It's meant for long-term retention of infrequently accessed data. So we went into Glacier, we created a vault, we gave the vault a name, we then went into IAM. We created a user and we gave that user permissions to access Glacier. We got the set of credentials in order to feed whatever third-party tool that we're going to use from an access key and a secret access key in order, to have that username password perspective so that we can use Glacier from that perspective. Finally, I hope this module was very informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.